Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Engineering Side of Data. I'm your host, Bob Haffner. We're going to be talking a little special category today. We're going to be talking about reInvent, the AWS Conference 2022. And to help me do that, we've got Alex Debrie here joining us. Alex, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm Alex Debrie. I'm an AWS data hero and do a lot of work with DynamoDB and consulting around that. I have a book around that, the DynamoDB book, and then I just do blogging and tweeting and all sorts of that stuff. So fellow Omahan here, and yeah, both of us made it back from reInvent in one piece.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah, I made it this year. So last year we did a recap. I wasn't there. I felt left out. I made it back this year though. Yeah. So yeah, good time. Yeah, we did make it back in one piece. A little bit of a cough, but we're here. We survived. Yeah. Hopefully back in 2023.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah,
it was pretty wild to see the size of it this year. You know, going back and seeing back to 2019 size. You know, with 50, 60,000 people, a little different than last year, which was a little more muted. You know, only 20 or 25. But yeah, this year was packed and crammed and everything. Yeah, back to normal almost.
Yep, that's for sure. Yeah, I heard around 60. Someone said that they were hoping or maybe planning for 80. Wow. 60 made it. I'm not sure. Yeah. But wow, I can't imagine they could have got more people there. So if it truly was 60, but they were thinking 80, I don't know how they could have done it because every session was jam packed, right? And yeah, very, very well attended. So yeah. Good hallway track. It's always a good thing with reInvent. Plenty of people come ready to be engaged and to do some networking and to have those valuable conversations that are outside of the typical sessions and workshops and labs and things like that. So that's always good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest part of it for me is just seeing who I can meet and talk to and hear what they're up to. You know, we can go back and watch the sessions at home, but just being in person and getting that time away to really just focus on some of that work stuff and tech stuff for a while is great.
Yeah. How'd your talk go this year?
It went well. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I did it this is the first time I did it with someone else. So I did it with Amrit Kumar, who's a senior principal engineer on the DynamoDB team. So super high up, really knows this stuff really well. I loved working on it with him because I just got to ask him a ton of questions about how Dynamo is working and all sorts of things about that. My biggest regret is that we didn't have more time. There's just so much you can cover. You know, even just in the data modeling, there's a lot of cool stuff to cover, but then also they released this new paper about how Dynamo works under the hood. And it's super technical, but very fun. And I think it would be fun to present that. They actually have an engineer, Akshat, who's been presenting that at QCon and things like that. So I wish we would have just had more time to talk about all that stuff, but it was fun.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's also another plus of reInvent is, you know, you often get access to some people that are really in the weeds, you know, kind of in the guts of a lot of these services that we know and love. So that's good. Yeah. Glad to hear the talk went well.
Yeah, and even just like in prepping for it, there's things he could tell me. I'm like, oh, can we put that in the slides? And he's like, let me run it by legal. And legal says, no, we can't. But it's just like, man, I wish we could just talk about all these little interesting stats or nuggets or changes that they've done over the years, things like that.
Yeah, you can blame me. I'll take the heat. That's all I got to do is just tell them that.
Yeah.
And how was, past reInvent, Rick Houlihan's talk was always kind of a highlight for you, but this year a little different. Yeah. So there he's with MongoDB, talking about MongoDB. How was that? Was that weird?
I actually missed it this year. I had another commitment at that time. It was on Thursday afternoon, and I already signed up for something else. Not a session, a different engagement. So I missed it. I'm bummed. I'm going to go home and watch it. I did get to see Rick a few times throughout the thing and just talk to him. And he's the same old guy. You know, he's just a flamethrower, and he'll just he won't let you get away with anything. He's a lot of fun to talk to. Yeah. What about you? Any talks that you went to that you particularly liked?
I did. I've had some good sessions. I enjoyed some of the chalk talks. You know, those tend to be a little bit more interactive. In fact, those were the only ones that had any kind of a Q&A. Most of the, the breakouts, of course, the labs are going to have, they're going to be interactive to some degree. But yeah, the Chalk Talks were good. They had some nice interaction. I attended one on using Apache Airflow in a distributed environment. I thought that was very enlightening. Let's see, would anything else come to mind? There was I made a good one on EMR. That went pretty well. Yeah, there's some good sessions. I actually made it to a decent number of them. So yeah, kind of a nice mix of sessions and hallway track and yeah, getting plenty of good food as well. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I haven't been to one of those Chalk Talks ever, but I just hear such good things about them, and I wish they would be online because I hear there's really good Q&A in there. I'm guessing that's another way to sort of like sneakily get some things maybe they're not supposed to quite say, but since it's a group of 40 people and it's not being recorded, maybe they can go a little off the record.
Yeah, there you go. No proof.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, they tend to be pretty small, and they can be challenging to get in if you're not reserved. So if you do want to go to a Chalk Talk next year, make sure you show up early and get a good spot in line in the walk-up section. So yeah, some good stuff. Yeah, I thought the going to the keynotes, some good keynotes this year. Maybe concept idea heavy, maybe not so much on the announcements, but pretty good nonetheless. And especially Werner Vogel's keynote, I thought was really well done. Make sure you catch that. It's already up on YouTube, as you can imagine. That's one of the first things they put up is the keynote section. So make time for that one. Good job of Werner incorporating some entertainment value as well as some educational value as well. So
yeah. I think the first hour of his, he comes out with this sort of like Matrixy video there, and then comes out with his duster on and like a Lambda shirt, and just like for the first hour was sort of like cranking out interesting tidbits or announcements sort of back and forth forever. And then it sort of tailed off at the end because it's hard to do that. It's hard for AWS because they're constantly releasing services and tweaks throughout the year, even the 2 weeks before reInvent. And then, and also a lot of the really truly foundational work has been done. And now it's sort of like either higher level services or new features or new connections between different things, which are useful and nice. But it's harder to have something like Lambda, right? Which is blew the doors off everything or things like that.
Very true. And I thought that EMR was the same way. There was a lot of, hey, we have, we're introducing support for Graviton 2 and some price reductions there. And now we can interact with these open data formats and things like that. Some very much appreciated features, but nothing that was like, oh my gosh, stop the presses type of a deal, but very valuable nonetheless. So yeah, the expo as usual was unique. I think in reInvent, I always think of the expo / vendor areas being, you might show up there one day and grab as many T-shirts as you can without getting your badge scanned. But this one, the expo is always lively. You can have a lot of good conversations if you want to. AWS has a presence there in terms of, education and things like that. It's so popular and it's always jam-packed. It's quite unique to reInvent, I feel.
They really do a good job there. And I think, the sponsors know not to come with just marketing talk and things like this. It's a pretty good technical audience. They're used to good sessions and technical sessions, and they want the same thing from the booths as well. So I think it's usually a pretty good setup they have.
Yeah, let's get into some. So we're going to be talking about the reInvent things that caught our eye, mainly, obviously around announcements. Definitely a data-oriented type of a podcast. We'll kick things off with. I'll go with Glue. So there was quite a few things that caught my eye with Glue. First one being they announced Glue 4.0. That mainly entails the support of Python 3.10. So that's a nice thing to be up to date with the Python world. Probably more importantly, Spark 3.3 as well. And with 3.3, and I think maybe even more importantly, 3.2, there's some nice features that come along with that. One of the ones that they've noted in the announcements was Panda support, which may seem a little confusing. Obviously you could always run pandas in the Glue environment. That's been there for quite some time. But I think they're referring to the pandas API support that's added in Glue 3.2, I believe it was.
Okay.
And I think they've got over 80% of the pandas API available through the PySpark runtime environment. So it's just makes it a little easier for people who like pandas, they're used to using pandas, can use it in the Spark runtime and reuse a lot of their code and have a nice familiar environment.
Yeah.
Before that,
what's it look like for you when you're working with Glue? Are you sort of editing in a notebook in the cloud, or are you submitting like a zip file of code and they're executing it for you? I haven't even done that much with Glue. What does that look like for you as a sort of developer experience?
Yeah, so they do have a concept of a notebook, right? They have, I think it's called developer endpoint, that you can hook a notebook instance to and submit, I guess, Spark jobs through that, right? So you can do that. So that's one option, but that's typically something you can do in a development environment. But the way I typically do it is I fire something like VS Code, write my Py scripts that are part of that. When I check into GitHub, for example, those things are deployed over to an S3 bucket, which is then picked up by the Glue environment.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yep. Let's see. They've added support for data formats such as Apache Hudi, Apache Iceberg, and Delta Lake. I'm pretty sure you've had the ability to write Apache Hudi tables before. I think they just made it a lot easier, and also Iceberg and Delta Lake as well, as like I mentioned. So they've kind of shored those up. Those are the big three in terms of this idea of having transactional data lake, those types of things. And now Glue has full support for them.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, I did hear a few people mention those throughout the week, and then you had to sort of educate me at the airport on like how these things actually work, what problem are they solving, where do they fit in the stack. So it's been interesting to see those take off.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely the technology behind the data lakehouse movement there, if you've heard that.
Yeah,
a lot of these data formats, these transactional data lake stuff. Yeah. They also announced support for Ray, which is interesting, right? That's another one of these out of core compute frameworks for Python, right? So similar to Dask, if you have ever heard of that, and kind of similar to Spark as well. It's this idea that you can run Python code in a distributed compute framework, right? So they've added that support as an option that you can use if you like Ray, you've used Ray locally. Now there's an avenue and there's an option to use it in the Glue environment as well. So just yet another way
sort of out of that world. I remember looking at Dask maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. Is Dask still a big thing? Is Ray more popular, or are they just sort of both options within the Glue world?
I see them. I think that Dask is a little more popular. I think maybe it's fair to say that Dask is, they're definitely, they solve a similar problem. They go about it differently. I think Dask is, again, a little bit more popular. Ray might be a little bit more popular with the scientific community. But it is this idea they have the scheduler, they have the ability to manage these Python workloads in a distributed fashion, right? It's just another way to cheat the Python GIL, right? The global interpreter lock, right? So, both very popular. Both have kind of a data frame like extraction, like for pandas and things like that. So,
Very cool.
Yep. Lastly, on the Glue front, they've come out with this Glue data quality feature or service as a part of the Glue. I think they built it on top of their open source DQ library. Okay. So this is a way that you can point at some data and it can recommend some rules, and then you can implement those rules. And you can do things like, hey, I expect this data set to have this type of distribution. It can have no more than this many nulls, things like that. The count must be between X and Y, things like that. And boy, I wish this service announcement is probably around a year too late for me, to be honest, because I used EQ on a glue project and did a lot of this legwork. Like I said, it would have been much appreciated if this announcement came a little sooner, to be honest.
Yeah, I haven't heard of DQ, the open source service. Is that, or an open source project? Is that an AWS project, or is that okay?
Yep, they started it. Similar to something like a Great Expectations. But it's aimed at the Spark data frame type extraction. Pretty handy, pretty performant. So it's good to see that they've kind of wrapped that up, and it's going to make it a little easier going forward. So
yeah, for sure. I remember being back in the data world and having that sort of issue where maybe you had a filter that was overly aggressive, and all of a sudden, instead of having millions of records, you have tens of records or whatever, and not noticing until you get further down the pipe and have to rerun a bunch of stuff. So cool.
The data quality thing, I think in the last 5 years has definitely been more of an interest for data engineers, right? To add that rigor to their pipelines, right? It's you need to have that. Again, it's a way to build and maintain confidence in your data, so you can kind of catch these things ahead of time. So they truly do help. And I'm looking forward to putting this one through the paces. So that's it for the glue stuff that caught my eye. I'll turn it over to you to talk about some serverless stuff.
Cool. Yeah. I always like the serverless stuff. I feel like there wasn't one sort of enormous thing, but I wanted to group together a few interesting serverless pieces that'll be nice for people in that world. So biggest one for me was EventBridge Scheduler. This was actually a pre-invent launch. And what this is, it allows you to sort of dynamically schedule tasks. Because right now you could do CloudWatch events with a scheduled thing and basically do like cron jobs, where if you want to do something every hour, every 5 minutes, once a day, once a week, things like that, very easy, slow moving tasks, you could do something like that. But if you had something where like, hey, this record comes in and you want to make sure to check on this in 2 days, maybe you want to check the status of it, or in 7 days, or this expires in 14 days and we want to run some process when that happens. There wasn't a great way to do like more dynamic sort of app-based scheduling where you're sort of registering as part of your business logic and flow and things like that. And people are, cobbling it together out of DynamoDB streams or DynamoDB TTL expiration there, and then maybe step functions and things like that. But the guarantees around it weren't great. So you had to build all this other tooling around it. It was just a pain. And now they have this EventBridge scheduler where you can schedule millions of events per month. Super easy. Just basically say, hey, schedule this Lambda function to be executed with this payload at this particular time, and it's going to do it for you. Now you can go clean up records or run some sort of process for a customer or whatever you need to do, which is really cool. So I think people are going to be pretty excited about that one.
Wow. Yeah. And the integration of EventBridge pretty much interacts with just about every service in the AWS world. So that's nice.
Yeah, they're really making EventBridge into sort of like a hub or a platform or something where you can build a lot of stuff onto. I didn't even get into some of the other EventBridge stuff. The second big serverless one for me was another pre-invent one. This was AppSync JavaScript resolvers. So in both API Gateway and in AppSync, which is like a managed GraphQL, you can do what are called direct integrations, where if you send in an HTTP request, you can connect directly to some sort of data source or other service without a Lambda, using what's called VTL. You have to write like this configuration language. Everybody hates VTL. It's just like really hard to write and evaluate, and it's very confusing. And now, at least in the AppSync world, they're letting you use like a smaller subset of JavaScript. Basically, almost all your JavaScript, except you can't do like file access or network requests. But you can do everything you want there. Otherwise, and it's going to make it a lot easier, I think, to do those JavaScript resolvers, and I think make it easier for people so they're not having to fall back to a Lambda function if they don't want to mess with VTL. So I think that's a big one as well. And then the last one for me, this one actually was at reInvent. This was at Peter's talk Monday night, but Lambda Snap Start. This is cold start is always an issue you hear with Lambda functions, right? When that function is invoked for the first time. And especially with like Java, C#, things where you got to start up some sort of VM to process these things. People want to be moving Spring Boot applications over, and they said it's taken 10, 20, 30 seconds for that initial cold start, just because it's got to load up the VM, initialize all those clashes and things. If you enable snap start, what it's going to do is when you deploy it, they'll sort of throw it onto a container. They'll start up that VM, and it'll pull in all those classes and all that initialization, what it needs to do. And then they'll create a snapshot of that memory and save it. And now when there is an actual cold start, they'll pull down that sort of memory snapshot rather than your code, and they don't need to start you up from zero there. So pretty interesting. There are a few like tricky edges to make sure, like if you're doing like a random seed somewhere in your application, like all of them are going to have the same random seed. So you need to be careful about that. But a lot of, I think it's going to, I talked to a lot of people that do Java work, and this is just going to be a big deal for them. And it's Java only for now. I'm guessing C# will be pretty close. And then maybe even Python, JavaScript might shave off a couple 100 milliseconds or so.
Nice. Yeah, that seems like another one of those nice feature updates that they've really helped out on cold starts in general, right? It seems like they've really paid a lot of attention and made a lot of improvements over the last few years in terms of serverless, right? Really see that as a problem, and they've definitely addressed it in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, that must be the one of the bigger complaints they get from people, because they spend a lot of time trying to work that out.
And the billing, right? When they went to the small intervals for the billing, right? Yeah, the cold starts and the billing. So just another example of AWS being pretty responsive. Yeah, interesting.
Exactly. So that scheduler, that's the big one for me. Those other two are pretty nice. But I know you saw a lot about Redshift as well. What are you seeing in the Redshift world? I love Redshift. So what did you see there this week?
I'm a big fan of Redshift.
Yeah.
I tell you what, they continue with the strong announcements. I just feel like in 2019 they came out with some nice announcements for Redshift, and the one that really caught my eye back then was the separation of compute and storage. Right, that was a little bit of a quite frankly, that Snowflake would point to and say, "Look, they can't do this, we can," and they were like, "Well, now we can." So that's was just a huge bullet point to add to the Redshift materials there. In 2021, they announced Redshift serverless. That was a big thing. That was also another one of those, hey, modernizing it, making it closer to this idea of scale to zero type of a deal. And they also came out with some pretty impressive announcements this year as well. So one of the things that they, in the main keynote by Adam, he talked about this concept of zero ETL, right? And he addressed it in two different ways. And one of them was they've come out with this Aurora to Redshift piece there. That's zero ETL. So it's almost like a light switch, flip it on, and you can get automatic ingestion from data in your Aurora database over into Redshift, right? Now, they say he used ETL a couple times. I'm assuming that is more on the ingestion side and less about the T. So more the E and the L and less about the T. I don't know if they're fitting any kind of transformation features in that, but that's pretty good. Nonetheless, it sounds pretty intriguing. Another anything that you can make it painless and to get data from a source to the target known as Redshift, hey, that sounds pretty good.
And honestly, back when I was doing Redshift and ELT work, ETL work, all that stuff, we did a fair amount of transformation in Redshift, where it's a pretty powerful compute processing engine itself. And sometimes you just load it into a staging table, do some transformation into another table, and that's easier than spinning up a bunch of Spark machines or something like that. So I think that'll work. I'll be curious to see what that delay looks like from Aurora to Redshift, and especially also how they handle updates, which is like a tricky thing for getting it from your sort of OLTP database into an OLAP database. How do you handle updates? That's going to be interesting to see. But man, I think, if this works out, it's a big one because, a lot of people are trying to build whatever the HTAP database where it's doing hybrid transactional analytics. I think that's going to be a tricky world. And I sort of, in this particular case, I think, hey, you want to have your OLTP database, you want to have your OLAP database, and each of them can do what they do well. And the big part is how do you get that data from one to the other?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, I guess, the details of how it works, mainly, like you mentioned, updates and deletes and what kind of control you could have over those things. And like you noted, absolutely, this would fit nicely. So he says zero ETL, but this could fit nicely. And again, like you noted, the ingestion, and then maybe doing like an ELT type of a pattern to do the transformations in Redshift. So I'm looking. Yeah,
I was going to say, I'll be curious to see if they do this with other database integrations like Dynamo to Redshift, same sort of thing. I think they sort of tried and experimented with glue elastic views as sort of like a agnostic middle layer that could go from take any source, put it into any output. And it seems like maybe now they're doing point to point, Aurora to Redshift, maybe hopefully Dynamo to Redshift, Aurora to Athena, whatever it works like there. But yeah, I'll be curious to see sort of how this area evolves over the next couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What's the next source? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Now the next bullet in his zero ETL concept, he talked about having Spark integration with Redshift. Now this one's a bit of a head scratcher for me. I don't, typically when you get the data in Redshift, your need for Spark there's not much of a need for Spark at that point, right? But in thinking about it a little bit more, perhaps there is, if you wanted to do some exploratory data analysis, if you're comfortable with Spark, you like the concept of Spark SQL, maybe even loading it up into a data frame to poke around, do some light analysis. You can do that now. And it sounds like you could do that before, but now it's going to be a little less painful to do that. They kind of touted they have this new data connector that they've built up to make things, the reads and the writes, easier, which kind of leads me into maybe there's an ELT pattern here that could work, right? So instead of SQL to do transformations, perhaps you could use Spark to do those transformations. So you read it into Spark, transform it, write it back to Redshift. So that one's going to be interesting to see how that one shakes out, how people use it. I'm kind of keep an eye on this one. Like I said, doesn't automatically resonate with me. I don't think I'll be using it, but I'm curious to know the use cases that emerge for this one.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was talking to someone that used to be kind of deep in this world, and I've been a little bit out of this world for a while. But he was saying he's like more bullish on the Spark stuff than like the pure data warehousing stuff. So he said like Databricks over Snowflake is actually where he thinks it's going to be going, because he said Databricks can do all the stuff Snowflake does, but it can also do the Spark stuff, and whether that's exploratory, whether that's ML and things like that. That'll be curious for me to see, because like, man, I always loved just doing queries against Redshift. You only need to know SQL and that's it, rather than sort of programming out some imperative type stuff. But yeah, that'll be interesting to see that sort of evolve. I hadn't heard that take on it.
Yeah, that'll be curious. Yeah, and I think that I guess we'll see, right? Yeah, it definitely one of the underlying themes of the analytics track of reInvent has been now Spark's everywhere, and you can use it here, you can use it there, Glue, EMR, of course. Now Redshift, and then we'll be talking about Athena later, but it's they definitely woven it into the majority of their services. So yeah, pretty interesting. They're definitely bullish on Spark as well.
Yeah, which is interesting. I sort of thought Spark was dying when I got out of the space a few years ago, just because it's like, hey man, why not just use the warehouse? But I don't know. I'm out of the loop, I suppose, on that one.
Yeah, I think that there's a fair number of people that I don't know, say that Spark maybe was dying, that maybe that SQL is making a resurgence. I'd like to think about that way, that SQL's, hey, there's a place for me in the ELT world, right? So don't forget about me. Yeah, very interesting. And just you mentioned the Databricks and Snowflake. I think that's going to be very interesting. I talked a little bit on my last episode with Eric Tulati about those two pieces and how they are kind of one end of the spectrum, kind of coming towards the middle. Yeah. And Databricks is missing a component of a database system. They're trying to make up the best they can with the Lakehouse concept, and there's some features that Snowflake is starting to pick up too. So that's also going to be an interesting part of the whole space.
Yeah.
Redshift, multi-AZ, right? I think this is maybe overdue, but perhaps, it's not exactly a trivial matter to introduce failover to another AZ when you're dealing with a distributed system like Redshift. So, but kudos to the team; they got it done.
What's the benefit there if my compute goes, like if an AZ goes down, I can still have compute somewhere else?
Yep, exactly. You can have it running in 2 days. Yeah. Now, I don't know if it's what I don't know, Alex, is it an active-active type of thing, or is it an active-passive type of arrangement? I'm going to assume it's an active-passive type of deal. My understanding was before, you could be up in another AZ within a matter of minutes, and now it's instantaneous.
Flip over.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So kudos to the Redshift team for pulling that one off. I'm sure that's another one of those things. Hey, we're still putting some time and effort into the Redshift system. Streaming ingestion. That's another one of those, trying to make it easier to get data into Redshift. They support Kinesis and the managed service for Kafka. And apparently they've made steps to make that a lot easier to tap those two streaming techs to get data into Redshift. So another good one. Looking forward to keep an eye on that one.
That's nice. Now you don't have to glue together sort of like Kinesis to Kinesis Firehose to S3 to loading it, all that sort of those hops, right? Just you handle that buffering and load it in there for me.
Yeah. And it says, I saw the note there that it comes in the form of a materialized view. So I guess that would be perhaps more like a materialized view that's acts like staging. Then you can just source from there into regular Redshift tables. So very interesting. Another one of those kind of keeping it painless as possible is the auto copy from Amazon S3. The way this was sold is, hey, if you have things that are in S3 and as they drop in, they get automatically loaded into Redshift. So, again, one of those, hey, get into there. We'll get it into, again, presumably some kind of a staging environment that you can take it from there. So that's pretty nice.
That's nice. That reminds me of like my first use case for Lambda was our logs company, Sumo Logic. They would just like dump us an archive of logs into S3 every like 5 minutes or something like that. I'd just have an object notification and load that into Redshift right away. And it's just like, now I don't have to do that, right? When they dump stuff in, it's going to make it to Redshift. I don't have to think about it anymore.
Yep. Pretty nice.
Yeah.
Some miscellaneous things in the space that I'll quickly go through is dynamic data masking. I'm sure that will be helpful for a number of folks out there dealing with sensitive information.
Yeah.
This one is a little interesting, the central access controls for data sharing via lake formation. I guess that'll just make it a little bit easier to manage that data access across your platform, including Redshift. That's a little bit cloudy for me, but looking forward to knowing more about that one. Yeah. And then now you can do backups of Redshift through the AWS backup service as well. So some good, some strong announcements for the Redshift service.
Yeah, cool. My next category was on networking, which is not super sexy or exciting, and I don't even know networking that well, but I think it's an area where they had a few announcements, might have flown under the radar, but I think will make a big difference to people. One of them this is another one from Peter DeSantis on Monday night, but they talked about ENA Express, and I don't understand it, but it's basically this enhanced networking protocol that they built themselves. It wraps your TCP or UDP calls and gives you better throughput, faster, lower latency, things like that. That's pretty amazing. Just like the things that they can do and that they're incentivized to do just because they're operating at such huge scale that they can go in and invent their own network protocol, right? And manage how that data is going throughout your thing. And you don't even have to make changes to your application. It's wrapping TCP and UDP. I don't even understand how it works, but I've been told it's going to be a pretty big deal that way.
Nice.
Yeah. And another one is VPC Lattice, which I glazed over when I first heard it. And then I heard someone tell me that one of the big serverless advocates was saying, hey, this is going to be one of the bigger deals for serverless applications going forward. But I think it gives you like a logical way to think about your networking stuff rather than dealing with security group rules and in and out traffic that way. You can sort of just say, hey, let this surface have access to this service, right? And sort of think of it that way. in a more natural way, I think might simplify some of that VPC management type stuff. So, that's an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that is often quite the headache, right? Of trying to share things across VPC. So that's, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And
so we'll have to
another
dig into that and see how it works over the coming weeks and stuff. But yeah, it could be a foundation of something good.
Heck yeah. Yeah, often you need a PhD to understand how VPCs share information, and then also what the cost of that sharing will be.
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. And and then the network protocol, only AWS, right?
Right.
Another, I guess both of those are good examples of maybe not the most glamorous announcements, but really impactful to a lot of different folks. So that's good.
Yeah.
All right.
What else? Just got any other odds and ends?
Yeah, I got some odds and ends, here. We talked about Spark and how it sparked this and sparked that. Yeah, Athena is the latest thing that got sparkified.
And how does that work?
Yeah, well, good question, Alex. I'm not. From what I understand is that, now in addition to running SQL like you always could with Athena over Athena tables, now you can fire up a notebook and you can query your Athena tables with the help of that notebook and Spark. So you can, once again, you do one of those exploratory data analysis type of thing. That's what Athena does, is this idea of a serverless, pain-free type of environment just to kind of get something going, explore your data, very interactive. And I think having Spark there as part of that service is just going to make it easier and another option. Because I know a lot of people, there's a fair number of people in the data space that love SQL, very comfortable with SQL, and there's a lot of other folks that are very comfortable with maybe more of a data frame concept when working and analyzing their data. And of course, you could do that, a year ago just by spinning up a notebook, whether it's locally or in SageMaker or doing something else in EMR. But this just makes it a little bit easier, right? You can just pop into the Athena environment and alternate between the two, between SQL and the notebook environment. So, yeah, that was interesting to see. Again, not necessary, but I think it'll make things convenient for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, they announced Data Zone. That would be another thing to keep an eye on. This seems to be perhaps a data management platform that contains a catalog, the ability to control access to various data sources, and even has a portal component too that kind of acts as like a self-service type of a deal, right? Where you can kind of explore, find out, explore information about your data, like metadata information about your data. They seem to be jumping into that space. I think this one was kind of I figured they'd do something about that. Seems to be in line with something like an Elation, something like a Calibra, to provide that nice little data management piece that they've been missing all this time. So, yeah, a couple of nifty items there that came out. What about you?
Yeah, a couple other, odds and ends. Step functions distributed map is a pretty interesting one. So step function is just a way to run a state machine through all these different things and have logic there. And they used to have a map step where you could maybe map out across 40 workers at a time. But with this new distributed map, now you can fan out to like 10,000 workers at a time. So if you want to process like a giant S3 folder in some way as part of your step function, you can just give it an S3 prefix and it'll iterate over each of those files and give each file to an input to a worker. Or like for me, I'm interested in integrating that with DynamoDB. And sometimes people need to run like basically an in-place ETL operation on their DynamoDB table, make an update on all their items. And now you can do a parallel scan where you're fanning it out across 10,000 workers in parallel, really processing that quickly in like a nice managed way. So that'll be curious. I'm hoping there's like some tooling on top of that. I know Rafal Winsky is working on maybe making like an easy DynamoDB scanner tool or processing tool basically on top of that. Another one that caught my eye is Amazon verified permissions. I don't know if you saw this one, but it's basically like this permissions language that you can use in your application. It's sort of IAM like. It's not quite IAM, but it's you can sort of define resources and conditions and things like that, and then check if someone is authorized to handle a particular action. So it's just like a permissions language that you can use in your application. It's kind of interesting to see AWS getting into that game, but it could be pretty useful to a lot of people. So I'll be curious to see if that takes off.
Yeah, I'll say. I mean, I don't know how many times I've, someone take a stab at trying to get access to an S3 bucket. Yeah. Oh, well, not only do you have the ability to list it, but also read it as well.
Yeah.
And then all these things that anything they can do to simplify that process that seems to be constantly tripping people up would be most welcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And then the last thing, they announced serverless OpenSearch. I had higher hopes for that. Everyone's been wanting a more serverless search solution, serverless Elasticsearch, and it's serverless in that it auto scales a little better than like a normal Elasticsearch would, but it's not quite serverless in that it needs a VPC. You need to connect to it that way. There's a pretty high minimum cost, $700 a month. So just not quite meeting the needs, I think, in that way. It's going to meet some folks' needs, but in terms of like the more pure serverless workflows, I think probably not going to work for that. And it's disappointing. They've had a few, Aurora serverless, Neptune serverless, now OpenSearch serverless, that all sort of don't quite, I think, meet the target of what the community wants on this stuff. And I think it's a hard problem. I think they're probably gonna have to start from scratch on a lot of this stuff rather than sort of retrofitting existing databases. But disappointing to see that out there, I think.
Gotcha. Hey, going back to the step functions distributed map, that was interesting. Yeah. And I guess more of a question about step functions as a whole and how they relate to, like, what need do you see those fulfilling versus something like EventBridge, right? Well, how do you, they kind of both do an orchestration of sorts, obviously different tech.
Yeah.
But could you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, in terms of EventBridge versus step functions, Jan Trey, who's a serverless hero, the Burning Monk, he writes a lot of really good stuff, and he actually has a post called Orchestration versus Choreography or something like that, and sort of like when to use each one of those. And the thing about a step function is like the logic is all centralized, and you're sort of saying what you want to have happen, right? This is going to happen, and then if this happens, go here. If that happens, go here, and you're sort of containing the logic, and it's very orchestrated, right? You're sort of telling it how you want it to work. Whereas with EventBridge, you can sort of be publishing events you could run that same workflow, and then you could just publish events after something completes, and you have different event listeners depending on what happens, but it's not as well sort of orchestrated, right? You're sort of expecting all these things to work in choreography with each other, right? And sort of a more, it's loosely coupled, but it can be, I think the downside to that sometimes is it can be hard to get visibility into how the whole thing works, and just to make sure it works as you can. So event stuff is good for certain things, but especially when that publisher doesn't know about as much of those consumers and things like that, when they're really truly decoupled. But if you have a specific workflow that has multiple steps and you want to have handled, that's where you want to wrap it together in a state function and make sure that logic is all contained rather than sort of tying it together more loosely with the events and things like that.
Gotcha.
Like, for example, if we say, like let's say like a user signs up. When a user signs up, maybe we want to create a record for them. We want to send them a welcome email, maybe bill their credit card, things like that, 5 things. Those are all parts of the same flow that we want to make sure all happen, right? But we also say when a user signs up, maybe we want to add them to our marketing list somewhere else. We want to get them in our analytics system. Those are like less core to that initial sort of sign up registration needs. And those might be handled up by EventBridge. Whereas that core action of signing up, registering, provisioning anything you need for them, that's going to be happening with your step function, because that's like what your service sort of guarantees as part of that sign up process.
That makes sense. And I think that step functions do a good job of kind of giving you the ability to wrap up that type of an action in almost like a transactional. I did a transaction.
Exactly.
If this fails, well, then we're going to go ahead and back out everything we've done so far.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. And I didn't do it justice. Go check out Jan's post. That's at the Burning Monk, and it's choreography versus orchestration. Really good stuff on sort of when to use each one. And really they fit together pretty well generally. Just different needs.
Yeah. I'll track that down and I'll put it in the show notes.
Cool.
So, yeah. All right. Awesome. I think we hit everything on our list.
Got it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining me, Alex. I really appreciate it. Yeah, another good reInvent that's in the books on to 2023.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Always good to see you. It was fun to hang out at reInvent and at the airport a little bit as well. And yeah, hopefully we'll both make it next year.
Yeah, hanging out next to the slot machines.
Just trying not to look, right?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Oh, that person looks so sad.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode.